In the autumn of 1879, in the high desert territory of southern New Mexico, a wagon came up for auction in the town of Callum Flats that nobody wanted. It had been sitting at the edge of the freight yard for 11 months, impounded after its owner died without heirs and without debts that anyone could name to claim it. The auctioneer, a thin man named Dobbs with a voice like a hinge in need of oil, started the bidding at $8 and nobody moved. He dropped to 6. He dropped to 4. On a cold Thursday morning with the wind off the Sandia Mountains carrying the smell of pine and dust, a young woman at the back of the crowd raised her hand and said, quietly, $2. The men standing around her laughed. One of them laughed long enough that he had to set his boot heel against the fence post to keep his balance. Dobbs knocked the hammer down before the laughter had fully died, because $2 was $2, and the wagon had been costing the county $1 a month in yard fees for nearly a year. Nora Vass was 26 years old and had been in Callum Flats for 9 days. She had arrived with a worn canvas satchel, a set of wood-handled tools wrapped in oilcloth, and $31 in coin she had carried from Tucson. She was not from Tucson. She was from a settlement north of Santa Fe where her father had run the only cooperage for 40 miles, and where she had learned, before she learned her letters, how to read wood. She could tell you the species of a plank by the smell of its grain, tell you where a stave had been cut from on a tree by the way the growth rings curved, tell you whether a joint would hold or fail by the pressure of 2 fingers at its seam. Her father had taught her these things not because he believed they would serve her, but because he could not help himself, and because she had a quality of attention that his sons lacked. Her father had been dead for 3 years. She had worked since then for a wagon builder outside of Albuquerque, who had paid her wages smaller than what he paid his apprentices, and credited none of her repairs to her name. She had left that shop on a Tuesday morning when the proprietor signed over her design for a reinforced axle housing to a buyer from the railroad without so much as speaking her name in the transaction. She left with the tools her father had left her and not another thing that had not been given to her freely. She rode south with a freighter she trusted, and she stepped off his wagon in Callum Flats because the town had a carpenter's yard and a lumber yard, and a population large enough that someone, she reasoned, would eventually need what she knew how to do. What she had not reasoned for was that the impound yard held a wagon she would have crossed the territory to see. She had noticed it on her 3rd day in town, when she walked past the freight yard fence on her way to ask about work at the lumber yard. The wagon had been pushed to the far side of the lot, nosed into the shadows under an overhang, so that only its rear end was visible from the road. What she saw from the road was a tailgate of a particular dark brown, not the bleached gray-brown of a neglected vehicle, but something denser, almost reddish at the edges where the sun caught it. She stopped walking. She looked at that color for a long time. Then she went to ask about work. She came back that afternoon with permission from the yardkeeper to walk the perimeter of the fence, and she studied the wagon for the better part of an hour without touching it. The body was a 3/4-ton freight wagon of a type that had been popular in the mid-1860s, with a box approximately 9 feet in length and a sideboard's height of about 22 inches. Nothing in those measurements was unusual. What was unusual was the undercarriage. The bolster blocks were heavier than standard for the box weight. The coupling pole was set 1/2 an inch lower than she would have expected, which meant the load it was designed to carry sat lower than a typical freight wagon would position it. That was not a careless choice. Someone had built this wagon to carry weight in a specific range and had adjusted the geometry of the undercarriage to do it efficiently. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She had requested permission to inspect it from the impound clerk on her 5th day in town, and the clerk had allowed it because nobody else had asked, and the wagon was taking up space he needed. She spent 40 minutes walking the frame with her hands. The wood was dense-grained oak throughout, Dry but not brittle, the joints still tight after what she estimated was 15 years or more. She found the seam on her third pass of the forward panel. It was not the kind of seam a wagon built in a hurry would have. The forward panel of the box, the headboard that sat behind the driver's seat and faced back into the cargo area, had a vertical seam running down its center that should not have been there structurally. The panel was wide enough to be cut from a single board. A center seam served no mechanical purpose. She pressed her thumb along it, following it from the top rail down to the floor of the box, and at a point about 8 inches from the bottom, she felt a slight give in the wood that was not the give of a loose joint, but of something built to receive pressure. A latch of some kind, not visible, not operable with any key she had ever seen, or any key a locksmith would recognize as belonging here, because there was no keyhole. The mechanism, whatever it was, responded to something else. She did not tell anyone what she had found. She went back to the boarding house where she was paying $4 a week for a room and a seat at the dinner table. And she lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind and thinking about her father's lesson on the use of a coopered seam in concealment work, which he had explained to her one rainy afternoon when she was 12 years old, citing a chest he had once been hired to repair whose mechanism had been installed by a German craftsman from Philadelphia, and which relied not on a key but on a specific pattern of applied pressure at 3 points simultaneously. She had asked her father at the time why anyone would build a lock that could not be opened with a key, and he had looked at her with the expression he wore when she asked a question she had almost, but not quite, answered herself. And he had said that a lock with a keyhole told an experienced hand exactly what to reach for. She thought about that lesson for a long time. The man who helped her move the wagon was named Gordo Reyes, and he was 61 years old and owned a small freight operation on the south end of Callum Flats, consisting of himself, a mule named Cordelia, and a covered work shed that had once been a smithy and still smelled faintly of charcoal in the summer heat. She had met Gordo at the lumber yard on her second day in town, where he was arguing quietly with the yard manager about the price of pine planking. He had the manner of a man who had once been given to large gestures and had learned over decades to hold them in. He did not speak quickly. He listened to her explain what she needed without interrupting, and at the end of it he said he would rent her the shed and his mule's labor for 60 cents a week, and she could start Monday. Moving the wagon took most of a morning. The freight yard keeper had been glad to see it go and helped without charge, and Cordelia pulled steadily despite the weight and the ruts in the road south of the yard. By midday, the wagon sat inside Gordo's shed with the door shut, and Nora standing beside it in the dim interior light, her hand against the headboard panel. If you have ever known someone dismissed by the people around them as merely stubborn, merely particular, you will recognize what Nora Vass brought to that shed on her first morning. She brought her father's tools, which included a set of chisels, ground to angles he had developed himself over 30 years, a small hand drill with bits he had hardened in a fire she remembered watching when she was 7, and a spoke shave of cherry wood with a blade so thin it sang when it bit into grain. She brought a notebook she had kept since her first week in her father's shop, written in the cramped hand of a child who had been told to write everything down, because the mind forgets but the hand remembers. She did not bring assumptions. She did not assume the mechanism was what she thought it was, and she did not assume she could open it quickly, and she did not tell Gordo what she was looking for, because she had no certainty yet that she was right. She started with the exterior, 3 days of careful cleaning with a stiff brush and a cloth dampened in linseed oil, working the accumulated road dust, and 11 months of yard grime out of the grain so she could see what the wood actually was. She worked in the early mornings before the heat climbed, the shed filling with the clean smell of oil and old wood, and she moved panel by panel from the rear gate forward. The side panels were white oak, which was common. The floor planks were a harder species, possibly rock elm, which was not common for a freight wagon, and spoke to a builder who had thought carefully about what the box would be asked to do over many years of use. The headboard panel, the one with the seam, was walnut. Dark, close-grained walnut, cut from a mature tree and dried with care, so dense that the grain was nearly invisible without strong light at a low angle. She lit a candle and held it at the surface of the panel and ran her eye along the grain in silence. Walnut was expensive and unnecessary in a freight wagon. It did not harden better than oak. It did not resist moisture better than elm. It had one property that the other species available in the territory did not have. It could be worked with fine detail without splitting, accepting joinery of exceptional closeness, which was why it had been the preferred wood for fine furniture and precision instrument cases since before anyone in the territory could remember. She told Gordo about the walnut on her 4th day when he came by in the late afternoon with a tin of coffee. She said it carelessly, as if noticing something small. He looked at the panel for a while. He said, "I have seen one walnut headboard in my life, and it was on a wagon built by a man named Harker who worked out of Mesilla. And that wagon carried a surveying commission's equipment for 3 years before it went missing in '67. She asked him what Harker had been known for. Gordo said he did not know the man personally, only his reputation, which was that he did not build anything without a reason, and that he had learned his joinery from an old country craftsman who had worked briefly in the territory before going back east. She wrote the name Harker in her notebook. Beneath it she wrote the year '67, and beneath that she wrote Surveying Commission. She spent the next 4 days reading the headboard with her hands, her eyes, and her tools in that order, working from the outside in and from the peripheral details toward the center seam. On the first day, she mapped the panel's surface by feel alone, eyes closed, moving her fingertips across the grain in slow parallel passes as her father had taught her to do when reading a surface for hidden work. On the second day, she brought light, a candle held at a shallow angle to rake across the surface and reveal any variation in height, too small to feel. On the third day, she used a thin blade to trace the seam, determining precisely where it ran and where it stopped. And on the 4th day, she found the pins. They were 2 small inset brass pins, one at the upper left corner of the panel and one at the lower right, dressed so flush with the surrounding wood that they were invisible until she ran a fingernail across them. Each pin was seated in a drilled hole of a specific diameter, about 3/16 of an inch. The holes were perfectly vertical, and the pins fit without any play at all, which meant the drilling had been done with a brace guided by a fixture rather than by hand. This was not the work of a man hurrying. This was the work of a man who had built the mechanism in his own shop, tested it, and installed it once with the certainty that it would not be found by anyone who did not already understand what they were looking for. Each pin could be depressed. She tested them separately. Nothing moved. She tested them in sequence, left then right, and right then left. Nothing moved. She sat with the panel for a long time, her thumb resting at the lower point of gift she had found in her first inspection, thinking about pressure applied simultaneously at 3 points, and about what her father had said about locks without keyholes. She tested the pins simultaneously, pressing both at once with 2 fingers of her left hand and holding them down, and with her right thumb she pressed the point of give 8 inches from the floor. She felt a faint click deep inside the panel, as if a bar had drawn back from its seat. The center seam parted. It did not swing open. It did not fall. It separated along the seam by perhaps a 1/4 inch, a deliberate, controlled movement, held by 2 hinges set into the back face of the panel that were not visible from the cargo side. She released the pins and the door held in its parted position, the internal hinges supporting it. She had to work the edge with her fingernails at first, then with a thin blade, drawing it outward with care so she did not stress the hinge points or crack the walnut at the seam. The compartment behind it was 11 inches deep, running the full width of the headboard, approximately 42 inches across. It was sealed front and back by walnut panels, the inner one being the false face of what appeared from the cargo side to be a solid headboard. The space was dark and smelled of old cedar, the boards inside the compartment walls having been lined in cedar shingles that had done their work well for 12 years or more. There was no dampness. There was no rot. The air was cool and dry and carried a quality of deep stillness, the stillness of a space that had not been opened in a very long time. Inside the compartment, laid flat against the cedar lining, were 3 items: a canvas pouch, rolled and tied with a leather cord, a flat brass tin of the kind used for surveying instruments, and a folded document sealed with a wax stamp that had cracked along one edge but held. She sat down on the floor of the shed and looked at these things for a long time without touching them. The candles she had brought burned steadily in the still air. Through the shed walls she could hear the wind in the street outside and the distant sound of a hammer somewhere in the freight yards. Inside the shed, there was only the candle and the cedar smell, and 3 items laid on a shelf that had waited, in the dark, for someone with the right hands to press the right places. If there is a moment in this story that a careful person might point to as the true beginning, it is this one. Not the auction where she spent $2 to stop other people's laughter. Not the freight yard where she first saw that dark walnut color and stopped walking. This moment on the floor of Gordo's shed, when she understood that she was looking at something someone had gone to enormous, precise trouble to hide, and that the hiding had been done with a craftsman's care, and that the craftsman was gone. She took the folded document first because it was sealed, and she could look at the exterior before she opened it. The wax stamp bore an impression she recognized from her time in Albuquerque, the seal of the New Mexico Territorial Survey Commission, active from 1863 to 1872. Below the stamp, in a hand that had pressed hard into the paper, as if the writer had understood he was making a thing that needed to be legible in a future he could not predict, was a name: Emmett Reese, Surveying Commission Liaison, Office of Territorial Land Records, Santa Fe. She opened the document. It was a land transfer instrument dated April 14, 1867, conveying a section of approximately 320 acres in the Rio Hondo Valley in Lincoln County from the Commission's designated trust holdings to a private party. The transfer bore 3 signatures. The first 2 she did not recognize. The third was Emmett Reese. The private party named in the transfer was a land company called the Rincon Grazing and Improvement Trust, headquartered in Santa Fe, represented by a signatory named Aldous Frith. She sat with the document for a long time. She opened the canvas pouch next. Inside were survey notes written in a precise, educated hand, covering 6 sheets of paper that documented in careful technical language a survey conducted in March and April of 1867 of the Rio Hondo section. The notes included bearings, elevation marks, and a notation of a reliable water source at the northeast corner of the section. On the 4th sheet, in the left margin, in the same precise hand, but written with what seemed to be a harder, more deliberate pressure, was a notation: prior claim documented, recorded Lincoln County Clerk, 1861, Holder Thomas Aguilar, active improved use confirmed. The notation was underlined twice. Nothing else in the 6 sheets was underlined. She opened the brass tin last. Inside, nested in a fitted felt lining, was a daguerreotype portrait of a man she did not recognize, perhaps 40 years old in the image, with a direct, level expression, and the sun-weathered skin of someone who worked outdoors. Beneath the portrait, folded to fit the tin exactly, was a deed of record dated September 3, 1861, conveying the Rio Hondo section, 320 acres in Lincoln County, to a man named Thomas Aguilar, signed by the Lincoln County clerk and bearing the embossed seal of the county office. She spread all three documents on the floor beside her and looked at them together. The 1867 transfer had conveyed land to Aldous Frith's company that was, in 1867, already legally owned by Thomas Aguilar. The survey notes documented the prior claim with a named individual and a county record date. The commission liaison whose name appeared on the transfer had signed documents that conveyed land he had reason to know was already deeded to a private holder, and someone who had been present in those events, someone who had possessed these documents and understood what they proved, had sealed them inside a wagon built for concealment in a compartment that could not be opened by any key. And that wagon had gone missing in 1867 and had stayed missing for 12 years. She thought about the man in the daguerreotype who had looked at the lens with that level expression, and she thought about the annotation underlined twice in the survey notes, and she thought about what it cost in the New Mexico territory in 1867 to place physical evidence of a land fraud in a hidden compartment and trust that someone capable of finding it eventually would. She told Gardo that evening when he came to close the shed. She showed him the documents in the order she had opened them and watched his face while he read. He was not a fast reader, but he was a careful one, and he went through the survey notes twice before he set them down. He said that he knew the name Aguilar. There was a woman in San Patricio, which was in Lincoln County, whose family name was Aguilar. Her grandfather had come to that valley before the war and run cattle on the Rio Hondo section for years. The family had lost it sometime after the war. He had not known how. She asked how old the woman was. He said she was perhaps 50, and that her name was Petra, and that she still lived near the valley. Nara spent 2 days copying the documents in full into her notebook, working slowly and carefully so that every notation in the survey notes was reproduced exactly, every bearing and elevation mark and marginal comment. She copied the deed language word for word. She traced the embossed seal of the county office with a pencil, rubbing on a separate sheet. She wanted working copies she could show without moving the originals more than necessary. On the 3rd day, she asked Gordo if he could drive her to San Patricio, and he said he could, and they went. The drive took most of a day across terrain that was beautiful in the particular way of the Rio Hondo country in October, the desert giving way to stands of cottonwood along the creek drainages and the mountains to the east, holding their color in the clear air. They said little to each other, which was Gordo's natural inclination and which she had come to understand as a kind of respect rather than a coldness. He drove. She sat with the notebook open in her lap, reading her copies, thinking about what she would say and what she would not say, until she understood what Petra already knew. San Patricio was a small settlement of perhaps 40 souls, with a church and a general store and a scattering of houses along the creek road. They arrived in the late afternoon, when the Rio Hondo Valley was filling with shadow from the east ridge, and the cottonwoods along the creek were showing gold against the dark hills behind them. Petra Aguilar lived in a house at the end of the road, with a garden on the south side that had been maintained for many years by many hands, the beds neatly bordered with riverstone, even in the late season when they held only dry stems and the remnants of summer's planting. She was a compact, deliberate woman with gray-streaked hair, worn back from a broad face, and eyes that assessed strangers with the calm, unhurried efficiency of someone who had learned over many years to take the measure of a situation before committing any part of herself to it. She came to the door when Gordo knocked and looked at them both for a moment before she said, in a voice that suggested she had been patient for a long time, about a number of things, that they had better come in. Nora showed her the original documents. She laid them on the kitchen table one at a time, naming each before she set it down so that Petra understood what she was looking at before she touched it. Petra looked at her grandfather's deed for a very long time. She did not pick it up. She bent over the table and read it where it lay, the county seal facing up under the kitchen lamp. She said that her father had tried to establish this claim in 1871 and had been told the record did not exist. He had been told the land had been in the Rincon Trust's holding since the Survey Commission's work in 1866, and that any prior record was a mistake of the county office. A clerk in Lincoln had told him there was no deed in his father's name, and no record of the county seal having been applied to any document conveying that section before the commission's work. She touched the county seal on the 1861 deed with one finger, very lightly, as if it were something that might dissolve. He had believed them, she said. He had no reason not to. He was not a man who thought of himself as someone the law would deceive. Nora said that the survey notes documented the prior claim. They had been sealed inside the wagon before the transfer was finalized. Someone who had been present in those proceedings, someone who had known what the transfer was doing and what the prior record proved, had hidden the evidence where they thought it would be safe until it could be used. Petra asked who had owned the wagon. Nora said she did not know with certainty who had placed the documents inside it, but that the wagon had been built by a man named Harker out of Mesilla, and that Gordo believed it had transported surveying equipment in the territory in the late 1860s. She said that someone with access to the commission's vehicle and the knowledge of what the transfer would do had commissioned the hidden compartment and placed these documents inside it before the commission's wagon was lost in 1867. She said she believed the man in the daguerreotype might have been that person, but that she could not confirm it. Petra looked at the portrait. She said that it was not her grandfather. She did not recognize the man. Nora said she did not think he was Tomas Aguilar. She thought he was the person who had tried to preserve the record, someone inside the commission's operation or close enough to it to know what was being done. Petra was quiet for a time. Then she asked, with the levelness of someone who had learned to control what she hoped for, whether documents 12 years old, found in a hidden wagon compartment, would be accepted by a recorder's office or a court. Nora said she did not know the law well enough to answer that with certainty. She said that a solicitor in Santa Fe would need to examine the originals and advise on the path forward. She said that the original deed, with its embossed seal and its recorded date preceding the commission's survey by 6 years, was a legal instrument that had been properly recorded and properly stored, and that the survey notes in their own author's hand and bearing the commission's identifying notations and dates documented the prior claim in contemporaneous technical language that could not easily be argued away as error. She said that the Rincon Trust's basis for title was a transfer executed against a documented prior claim, and that this was now in someone's hands who had not been in a position to prove it before. She folded her hands on the table. They would still try to argue, she said. She wanted Petra to know that plainly. Petra said she had understood that much about the way of things since she was a girl. She had learned it watching her father write letters that received no answers, and ride to Lincoln on days when the road was difficult, and come home without what he had gone for. Then she said that she would like to have a copy of the documents if Nora could spare it, so that she could study them before deciding how to proceed. Nora gave her the notebook. They left San Patricio in the early evening, Gordo turning the mule onto the road north while the last color faded from the east ridge. He drove in silence for a long time before he said with the quiet of a man who doesn't make many observations, but means the ones he makes, that he had seen a great many things in 61 years of moving freight across the territory, and that in his experience the documents that moved the world were not the ones that declared power, but the ones that proved a thing had existed before power arrived to erase it. She did not answer him. She watched the Rio Hondo Valley fall behind them in the dark and thought about the cedar-lined compartment, dry and cool, and the 12 years those papers had waited in the dark for the right hand to press the right places. Someone had made a careful thing in 1867 and trusted it to the future, not knowing if the future would come in a year or 10 years, or ever. She thought that was its own kind of act, to build a concealment with that kind of patience, and she thought that whoever had done it deserved to have been right about the future arriving. The months that followed were slow and specific. Nora found a solicitor in Santa Fe named Caldwell, who charged her $3 to examine the documents and produced a written opinion that the original deed was a valid instrument of record and that the survey notes constituted contemporaneous evidence of the Commission's awareness of the prior claim at the time the transfer was executed. He wrote letters to the Lincoln County Records Office and to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe on Petra's behalf. The Land Office wrote back formally and at length, raising questions about the provenance of the documents and the circumstances of their recovery, and the solicitor answered each question in turn. She paid Caldwell out of money she was earning by then, having found work at a wagon shop in Callum Flats whose owner had needed someone who could read a frame's faults by feel, and had hired her on a trial basis that became permanent. The Rincon Grazing and Improvement Trust had passed through 3 owners since Aldous Frith, and Frith himself had died in 1875. The current holder of the trust's Santa Fe land interests was a broker named Cass, who had acquired the assets without, the solicitor believed, full knowledge of what the underlying title chain contained. When the Territorial Land Office produced its formal inquiry in the spring of 1880, Cass retained his own counsel in Santa Fe, and the matter proceeded through correspondence and several formal exchanges of documentation that Caldwell described to Nora in letters she read in the evenings at the shop after Holt had gone home. There was one formal hearing in Santa Fe in October of 1880, a proceeding before a land office examiner at which Nora was present and Petra was present, and the original 1861 deed and the survey notes were entered into the record. Cass's attorney made the arguments she had expected. He argued that the documents had been removed from a vehicle of uncertain provenance, that the chain of custody was unverifiable, and that a deed 12 years old found in a concealed compartment had not been produced through any recognized process of record recovery. The solicitor answered that the deed bore the Lincoln County Clerk's embossed seal, that the seal's characteristics matched those on record from the county office's instruments of that period, and that the survey notes bore identifying information consistent with the Commission's records in Santa Fe. He pointed out that the Commission's 1867 survey had been conducted in March and April of that year, and that the transfer instrument was dated April 14th, placing the conveyance within weeks of the survey's completion, and that the margin notation documenting the prior claim was in the same hand as the survey notes' body text, meaning the surveyor had known of the prior claim during the survey itself and had recorded it. The examiner asked the solicitor why, if the surveyor had known of the prior claim, he had not formally objected to the transfer. The solicitor said he could not speak to what choices the surveyor had or had not made, but that the documents before the examiner demonstrated what the surveyor had known and had preserved. The result was not a dramatic reversal. It was a decision by the Territorial Land Office in December of 1880 that the 1867 transfer had been executed against a documented prior claim, and that the original record of title in Thomas Aguilar's name had legal precedence. Cass accepted a settlement that returned the Rio Hondo section to the Aguilar family's claim in exchange for compensation for improvements made to the land in the intervening years. The compensation was a modest sum. The land itself was 320 acres in the Rio Hondo Valley, a life's work for a family rather than a commercial holding, with the water source at the northeast corner that the survey notes had documented, and that the cottonwoods along the creek had confirmed for 65 years without anyone's permission. Petra received the letter of determination in January of 1881. She wrote to Nora with 2 sentences. The first thanked her. The second said that she intended to plant the south field the following spring. By that time, Nora had been working in Callum Flats for more than a year. She had repaired a quantity of farm wagons and freight wagons, rebuilt 2 wheel sets that had been allowed to deteriorate past what a prudent owner would have permitted, and corrected the assembly of 1 private carriage that had been put together at the point of sale with the reach rod improperly fitted, which had caused it to pull left and cost the owner considerable distress and some quantity of money. Before anyone thought to examine the chassis, the shop owner, a fair man named Holt, had offered her a partnership on terms she had not yet accepted, preferring to observe whether his fairness held across a full turn of seasons before she committed her name to a shared enterprise. The wagon she had sold in October after the documents had been copied into the official record and the originals lodged with the solicitor for safekeeping through the proceedings. She had sold it to a freighter in Tularosa for $19, which was considerably more than anyone in Callum Flats had considered giving it. On the Thursday morning, Dobbs knocked the hammer down. She had repaired the headboard panel before the sale, fitting the compartment door with a brass hinge of her own making and a plain iron latch that was visible from the cargo side and opened in a straightforward way. She had not told the freighter about the compartment's prior concealment. The wagon was sound. The wood was as good as it had been 15 years ago when Harker built it, and the man who bought it could keep whatever he chose in the space behind the headboard. Gardo Reyes came by the shop one afternoon in the late spring of 1881 to drop off a spoke that needed a new metal shoe and to ask how things stood. She told him about the land office decision and about Petra's letter. He listened without interrupting, which was his way. He said he had expected it would work out, eventually. She said she had been less certain than that. He looked around the shop for a moment at the wagon under repair in the center of the floor, and the tools hung along the north wall in the order her father had established in a different shop in a different territory, 30 years before. Each tool at the height and position where a hand reaching from memory would find it. Then he said that her father had taught her a careful way of looking at things. She said that was right. He picked up his receipt for the spoke and folded it into his shirt pocket and went back outside. She heard Cordelia's slow hooves on the road for a moment, the particular rhythm she had learned to recognize over the months she had been renting his shed, and then the sound faded into the ordinary noise of the afternoon. The door swung half shut behind him and let in a bar of late spring light that lay across the floor of the shop and across the underside of the wagon she was working on, picking out the grain of the oak boards in the frame. She turned back to the work. The tool she reached for was a chisel her father had ground himself, the handle worn smooth at the grip by years of his use before it ever reached her hands, the blade still sharp because she kept it that way. She set it to the joint she was evaluating, not yet cutting, just reading what the wood had to tell her about where the pressure had been wrongly applied and where the repair needed to begin. This was the part of the work most people did not see and would not have recognized as work at all. It looked like standing still. It was not standing still. The wood told her what it needed. It generally did, if you brought to it the kind of attention it deserved and the patience to listen before you cut. If there is something in this story that stays with you, Something about what can be hidden inside a thing the world has already dismissed. Leave that thought in the comments below. Stories like this one exist because someone took the time to find them, and there are more of them than you might expect, waiting in the dark for the right hands. She pressed the chisel along the joint, and the grain gave way cleanly, the way good work does when the hand that holds the tool understands what it is asking of the material.